As you heard, my name's Rebecca Stanbrook, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about ICH E6R3 at your ICH Guideline Training Workshop. Many thanks to the Korean Ministry of Food and Drug Safety for the invitation. I'm very honoured to be able to present to you today. So obviously I have the usual disclaimer. These are my views, not those of Novartis, FPIA or the expert working group. So today I'd like to talk about the background to the revision, what was the process for that revision, and a little bit about this change in structure from the R2 version. And then we'll delve a little bit deeper into what that means for the investigator, the sponsor, and of course you can't talk about the sponsor without the protocol. A little bit about central records, so that's a section which has changed an awful lot. A sneak peek at Annex 2, and then just some thoughts to consider as we move along. So you see that I'll be utilising some slides from the Step 4 slide deck that accompanied the adoption of ICH E6R3. I would certainly recommend to take a look at the ICH website, as there are these training decks, but also some training material which will be coming out shortly that has been developed with MRCT in conjunction with the ICH Expert Working Group. That's just the legal notice. So let's talk about the development process. Where did we start from and what are the expectations now? So just a brief reminder about the ICH process. So you'll know that it comes in 5 steps. So after you've had the initial idea and the agreement of the ICH Management Committee that a new topic is going to be developed or a topic updated, then we need to create an informal working group. They will then pull together a concept paper to say actually what it is we want to write down in this guideline. This then gets signed off by the topic leaders, and we go into the creation of a draft guideline. So this involves discussion around the table to determine the text that will be included in the guideline. Goes through various iterations. We have caucus reviews, and then when the team is happy with the guideline, it then gets endorsement by the regulators and the assembly at step 2, which means it then goes off for sign off for consultation. So this is the public's opportunity to take a look at the guideline to give their comments on that. So I'd always recommend that for any guidelines, do take a look and provide your comments. So we then have that regulatory consultation, as I was mentioned, and at step 3, and of course you get many comments. And so the expert working group then needs to look at those comments and make adjustments. Once they're happy with that, it goes through the internal sign-off process, and the regulators sign that off, and it gets adopted at step 4 of the ICH as an ICH harmonised guideline. That's not the end of the process though. So it's adopted, but actually it isn't implemented by the regulators at that point. That is when it reaches step 5. So let's think about the long journey that we've had with ICH E6R3. So you'll probably be able to cast your mind back to when the guideline reached step 2, where it was out for public consultation in May 2023. We of course then reviewed those public comments, and the final document was finally signed off in January of this year. And then it has to be implemented by the regulatory members. And if you can cast your mind back, this is a document that's based on a concept paper which was approved in November 2019. So you can understand that it's not a short process to develop a document. Obviously, we had times when we weren't able to meet during the pandemic, but it is quite a long process. So why did we need to have a new revision? So you might well say, well, it was only in 2016 that we had a revision to ICH GCP. And you'll recollect the R2 version, that there was new text, but all of the original text dating back from 1996 remained. So they only were able to add addenda to the text and not change any of the original text. So as a result, when that came out, there was questions from the academic community saying, well, it doesn't go far enough, it's not proportionate. So it looks like it's a one-size-fits-all when you talk about clinical trials. But as we know, every clinical trial is different. And they actually did write a letter to ICH and a number of the regulators to express their disappointment about the lack of proportionality. So as a result, if you look at the ICH website, you'll see that back in January 2017, so remember that R2 came out in November 2016, just 2 months later, there was a reflection paper written about the GCP modernisation. And one thing to take note here is it wasn't just E6 that was revised, but also E8. So E8 used to be called General Considerations for Clinical Trials. It's now called General Considerations for Clinical Studies, and it brings in a wider type of study, so not just interventional clinical trials that we see in E6R3. And you'll see there in E8 that basis of quality by design. So really thinking about what is the research question and what is the data that's needed to answer the research question, and then building quality in. It also brought in critical to quality factors, which both you'll see as a theme that's moved also into R3. So it's really telling you to think about what is your research question and then collect appropriate data. And you'll notice that throughout it talks about a proportionate risk-based approach. It's really recognising that one size doesn't fit all for a clinical trial because all clinical trials are different. So what about the development process? So where did we start from? Well, of course, we had that open letter, so that was a good start. We also had a survey that was undertaken by the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative City. We also had regional stakeholder engagement in the form of public workshops and surveys. And of course, we had a variety of ICH guidelines to already look at so that we could make sure we were being consistent. Also, E6 did something very revolutionary for ICH in that we had stakeholder representative engagement. So the E6R3 expert working group engaged with academic stakeholders in a series of meetings to seek their input into the guideline. And that we found very, very useful. And you can see the strategy for that stakeholder engagement on the ICH website. So just look at the efficacy guidelines, E6R3, and you'll see all the supporting information. We also wanted to make sure that it was a transparent process as possible. So you'll notice that back in 2021, we published the draft principles. So you had a bit of an idea of the direction of travel. And then, of course, we had the public consultation, which lasted for 6 months from May to November of 2023. And can you believe that we had 7,000 comments? And each one of those comments was reviewed. So you can understand why it took some time from November 2023 till the final principles and Annex 1 document was adopted in January of 2025. So let's just have a look at the overview of E6R3. So you'll notice that we have the principles, as they always were there before. However, you'll see that we've moved from 13 principles to 11, and we've really sort of given some additional detail in and above that sort of high level principle. So really sort of what does that principle mean? And then you see that we've got annexes. So Annex 1, considerations for interventional clinical trials. So any type of clinical trial, interventional in nature, should be conducted under the auspices of the principles and Annex 1. However, with this advent of this new digital technology, which was another point that was made in terms of why we needed to have a modernisation of GCP, and that whole GCP modernisation in terms of E8 as well, because we have decentralised clinical trial elements, we have pragmatic elements, and so we thought we would have an Annex 2 giving some additional considerations for those different types of trial design and different data sources, all underpinned by those principles. And it's a revised structure as well. So you'll notice immediately that in addition to the annexes, we have appendices, and also the glossary is moved to the usual place that you would find the glossary at the end of the document. Now, the idea behind having annexes and principles, it's taken us, 5+ years to get this document into place. And it could be that there are some small changes that need to be made. And so there's a train of thought of, maybe if we're able to make in short targeted updates. So watch this space for further information about that, and perhaps even take a look at the management committee meeting minutes to see a little bit more about that. So what about the scope? You heard me mention about interventional clinical trials. And so this is the scope of E6R3. So interventional clinical trials on investigational products intended to be submitted to regulatory authorities. However, these principles of GCP could be applicable to other types of interventional clinical trials that aren't actually intended to support marketing authorization. However, this has to be in accordance with local requirements. So the annexes provide the basis for the interpretation and application of the principles. And so you need to consider those. But also, it's encouraging a risk proportionate process all the way through your clinical trial. So, there's more than one way to be able to meet the spirit of the principles. The annexes provides that guidance. So let's think about the substantial changes versus perhaps some more cosmetic changes. So when you think about substantial, obviously the principles have changed greatly. So much more meaty in tone, but also less in number. Then we've got the Annex 1, so there are some large changes in the investigator and sponsor sections. And then there's that new section on data governance. This was a recognition of the fact that there are lots of computerized systems now being utilized, not just by the sponsor, but also by the investigator. And so both need to consider how these systems handle data and appropriate validation of those systems. Then Appendix C, that also has changed greatly. So the essential records for the conduct of a clinical trial. Notice we've changed it from essential documents. And then the glossary. So not only a move in where the glossary sits within the document, but also a really consideration of, are there any new terms that we need? Are there any terms that need amending? And then we had some other changes. So in Annex 1, you'll see the Institutional Review Board / Independent Ethics Committee. So we indicated in there that, in some jurisdictions, the sponsor makes the submission to the Ethics Committee. And then Appendices A and B, the investigator's brochure and the protocol, really just some more minor tweaks. So let's think about the investigator. What are the main changes in the investigator section? So let's start by looking at the glossary. So you'll notice that both the investigator and the investigator site definitions have changed somewhat. So you'll see that we talk about the investigator, can be read as investigator and or institution, and we'll just refer to the investigator pretty much throughout the document. And they are the leader of a team, and so they might be called the principal investigator. Additionally, investigator site. In this age where we have a number of decentralized clinical trial elements, sometimes you'll find that it's not actually the activities being undertaken at site, but it might be at a satellite site, it might be in the participant's home. And so we change the definition of investigator site to say the locations where trial-related activities are conducted and or coordinated from under the investigator/investigator institution's oversight. So you can see there's a subtle change there, recognising the fact that not everything happens under the investigator's roof, under that brick and mortar site. So you'll see at the start of every section in the Step 4 deck that we give a handy hints and tips. So where does it say in R3 versus where was it in R2? Because I'm sure many of you will be very, very familiar with R2 and gaining your understanding of what's written in R3. So always take a little look at that Step 4 deck if you're not clear where something is residing. So let's talk about a really important area, the informed consent. So we recognised that there could be various approaches to how informed consent is taken, i.e. the information that is provided for somebody to be able to make a considered decision as to whether they want to participate in the trial. There could be various formats, so some people read things better, other people might hear things better, and so here we've given the provision for different types of formats, videos, interactive possibilities, any way that you can get over the information that they need to determine whether they want to participate in the trial. Now, I remember when I started out in the industry, informed consent might be 4 pages, and a 5th page would be the sign-off page. These days, informed consents can be 40 or 50 pages, so we really wanted to make sure that people were considering how clear and concise these informed consents could be and trying to use simple language and avoiding unnecessarily complexity. We also recognised that informed consent could be documented in different ways. So it could be the old use your method of paper, or it could be electronic. But of course, whatever, it needs to indicate that that participant has agreed to take part in the trial and the date that they agreed to do so. And also we mentioned about the possibility to take consent remotely. This of course depends on local regulations. We also talk about reconsent. So when new information becomes available, which might change a participant's mind as to whether they actually want to continue in the trial, then when do you need to reconsent? You need to think about what stage is that participant in the trial. If this new information is specifically about the investigation or product administration and they've finished the administration of that product, do they really need to have a knowledge of what that new information is? So consider when that new information is needed to be given to the participant and when reconsent is necessary. Of course, any revision to the informed consent materials need to be approved by the Ethics Committee prior to use. We also thought about minors being included in trials and the use of age-appropriate assent materials. Now, obviously, you wouldn't expect a baby in arms to be able to provide assent, but when they've got a cognizant and able to provide some form of assent, so perhaps sort of school age and upwards, depending again on the local legislation, then assent should be provided in a format which is understandable. So I've seen assents for children of perhaps 7 years of age that have been very graphical in terms of cartoon drawings to try and explain what's going to happen during the trial, up to sort of more later age children where perhaps there's less graphical, more information in a written format. So it's all, though, in accordance with local regulatory requirements. In the guideline, we also clarified the expectations for training qualifications and some flexibility about the documentation. So if a nurse is doing what they always do in terms of blood draw and the documentation of the information that they're taking on that particular patient, as they would do for that type of patient with that disease state, what additional training do they need in terms of trial-related training? So, it's what is needed to fulfill their role in the clinical trial. So think about that. The reason we thought about this was because these delegation of authority logs were getting to be a whole industry in themselves, with everybody written down on the delegation of authority log. So now we're thinking, well, if you've got the pharmacist, a head pharmacist, and they are told how to conduct the activities of the pharmacist in the pharmacy, perhaps the reconstitution, they're then responsible for making sure the pharmacy staff do this in accordance with the protocol, so perhaps then delegate the head of the pharmacy. We also recognised that other appropriately qualified health professionals might be involved in the medical care of participants in line with their normal activities. So it could be that you have a primary care physician is providing data for the clinical trial in accordance with their normal activities that they would undertake for that type of patient. And I'd certainly recommend to look out for Annex 2 when that is finalised, and perhaps even read the draft of Annex 2 if you haven't already. We also thought about safety reporting. So we included unfavourable medical events occurring in participants prior to investigation or product administration. So sometimes you might have an activity that is undertaken before investigation or product administration, i.e. during screening, that actually might cause some type of adverse event. So we wanted to make sure that they were captured in accordance with the protocol, of course. We also wanted to clarify responsibilities. So, as we know, we have now some decentralised clinical trial elements. So perhaps a home nurse is contracted on behalf of the investigator, but the investigator needs to maintain the responsibility for the oversight of that particular person engaged in the clinical trial. So once again, we come back to the delegation. So the oversight needs to be appropriate in accordance with the delegated activities. So you notice we've changed investigator supervision to investigator oversight. Now that is on the back of discussions with our academic stakeholder representatives, because what they said was, well, supervision, it means that you're actually looking over somebody's shoulder. And actually there is a whole range of oversight measures that can be undertaken, because if a nurse is conducting their normal activities, would you expect the investigator to be looking over that nurse's shoulder? We also put in some information about when participants don't reach the routine end of the trial. So how are those participants followed up? And we also included language about the potential loss of already collected data. Of course, that's in accordance with local regulatory requirements. So, of course, in this age where we are in a computer age, investigators have computerized systems, so we clarified investigator responsibilities there. We also talk about source records and the expectations for the timed review of these records, and of course access to that data. We'd also talk about investigational product management, So the sponsor may be able to support some aspects of investigator and product management. So perhaps the drug accountability that might be supported by an interactive response technology system. And also we talk about investigator oversight of the investigational product, and it's dependent on the characteristics of that investigational product, the routes of administration, the complexity, and of course the marketing status. So here we're bringing in that potential for proportionality and a risk-based approach. So where you have marketed products that have an authorization, then actually perhaps there are some variations that you can have on how that is handled. So maybe it comes directly from the pharmacy and the pharmacy documentation is sufficient. We also talk about the ability for the investigators to unblind without undue delay. So that there were some occasions when there was the sponsor would write, oh yes, and if you want to unblind, please do call us first. Where there is a need, there's a medical emergency, the first thought is for the participants' safety and welfare. And so the investigator should be able to unblind without delay. So that also means that where you're utilising an interactive response technology for unblinding, that you need to make sure that the investigator has actually been able to access that system. So let's then move on to the sponsor. So once again, we've got that handy section in the Step 4 deck that tells you where things are in R2. And what you might notice here is we didn't previously talk about the sponsor having adequate resources, and there was no mention of sponsor oversight. But of course you'll remember sponsor oversight is something that's not a new term, but it just wasn't written down in GCP previously. And then you'll see that there's been some reordering of the sections, really trying to sort of make it in line with the conduct of a clinical trial. So thinking about trial design, you need to make sure that you've got appropriate data from your non-clinical trial studies and your clinical trials and real-world data to support that human exposure. And implement this quality by design right as you write the protocol. So almost try and de-risk the protocol. Are there critical to quality factors? If I don't get this right, then it has potential to have an impact on participants' right safety and well-being or the reliability of those trial results. So think about how you manage those important risks. Also, we talk about engagement of other interested parties might help in the trial design. So this is also seen in E8R1. So we talk about engagement of patients, patient advocacy groups, healthcare professionals to really build a trial which is fit for purpose for that particular patient population. And of course you want to make sure that the protocol and other data acquisition tools and other documents that you might have, so for instance a data management plan, are fit for purpose. So once again we're trying to make sure that things are clear and concise. But you need to make sure that your data management plan actually meets the needs of the protocol. So I've seen where you've got a protocol that's clearly defined what data needs to be collected, but then the case report form, sometimes the case report form didn't collect all the data that was required by the protocol, and then other times I've seen where the case report form has collected more data than was required by the protocol, and of course both are unacceptable. You'll also notice about this conciseness. We want to try and decrease and not place unnecessary burden on the participants and the investigators. We also talk about agreements. Make sure that agreements are in place prior to the service providers or other parties conducting any trial-related activities. So you need to make sure your independent data monitoring committee has an understanding of what they will be doing and what the expectations are, where they're going to get the data from, when they're going to get the data, what the expectations of their reporting. Really make sure they are clear. And where you've got changes in perhaps the protocol, then you need to make sure that any agreements are updated as well to reflect any of these significant changes. Sponsor oversight. So we talk here about the extent of the oversight measures need to be fit for purpose and tailored to the complexity of the trial and the associated risks to those critical to quality factors. So do what makes sense so that you can ensure your patients are safe, or your participants are safe, should I say, and the trial results are reliable. We also talk about quality assurance and quality control processes. You need to be implemented for the oversight of not just the investigators, but also your service providers. Are your service providers doing what you're expecting them to do? Have you been clear in the agreements what the expectation is of them? And we also talk about central monitoring. So you might be looking at data in your clinical trial database to look for outliers, perhaps at a trial investigator site level, to see if there is potential for participant safety issue at that site. Also, we define the fact that monitoring is actually a QC activity, and that other facilities outside of the investigator sites, you need to sort of make sure that you're also considering the oversight of those facilities as part of your quality control strategy. Then we really fine-tuned the quality management. So think about critical to quality factors as you're writing the protocol and the risks to those factors. So you're really sort of in that continuous loop of making an assessment and then looking at how you're overseeing those factors and having any control of those risks to those critical to quality factors. And of course, we encourage proportionality throughout. So we talk about acceptable ranges. So you'll see when I talk about the protocol section that we sort of talked about sort of some limits, whereas at some point that this is exceeded, then that actually might mean that there is a problem, and so it's kind of a trigger to say, right, I need to take a look at this. So then moving on to computerized systems and data management. So you'll notice that there's a little bit more information in the guideline about statistical analysis and the finalization of data sets prior to the randomization code being applied to that data before it goes to statistical analysis. So it includes there about the potentials for unblinding, and so it's really trying to sort of follow the data flow through a clinical trial. So basically, we're saying make sure your computerized systems are fit for purpose, you validate them in a risk-based, proportionate manner, and think about what happens to the data throughout the life cycle of your clinical trial. So you've got data that's being generated by the investigator, by the investigator site, other data coming from different sources, so it could be from a central laboratory. How does that all come together as part of your clinical trial database? And so we really were making sure that you consider carefully about your finalization of those data sets prior to statistical analysis, because you want to minimize the potential for bias. So let's move on to the protocol. What are some of the changes that we see in the protocol itself? So that's Appendix B. So once again, we've given the handy hints as to where you'll find it in R2. And you'll notice that there are some sections which have a little bit more written in them than previously. And also, we include the fact of discontinuation by the investigator, not only withdrawal of the participant's consent from the trial. You'll notice there were a couple of sections that didn't have anything written in them in the past, so quality control and quality assurance, and also data handling and record keeping. So we actually gave some ideas as to what that could include when you're writing your. So yes, let's look a little bit deeper into the protocol itself. So once again, we were trying to encourage simplicity and conciseness in the writing of the protocol. We also talk, and you'll see in the preamble, about these are the aspects that are generally included in the protocol. We also talk about adaptability, so building that flexibility in, so perhaps the use of acceptable ranges. So do you need to take that blood draw at a particular time point on a particular day, or is it just important that you have that blood draw and the blood results that go along with that? So as usual, it's a GCP answer of it depends. So obviously if it's a PK trial, then it's jolly important when the blood is drawn. But perhaps for some other trials, it's less important. So what we're trying to do here is get people to focus on the protocol deviations which mattered the most. So by having an acceptable range, then you can really have the protocol deviations which could have an impact to participant safety. So as I say, we were really trying to sort of encourage that simplicity and make sure that the protocol is operationally feasible. So are you expecting the investigator to see a patient down in the MRI scanner, but then 5 minutes later conduct an ECG? Is that feasible? So write it with that feasibility in mind, and that patient and healthcare professional engagement can help that. But one caveat there, when you read E6R3, yes, we talk about engagement of healthcare professionals and patients, but it's not necessarily on a trial level, it's more on a product development level. So I'd also look in that case to E8R1. We talked about the withdrawal of consent or the discontinuation and sort of the appropriate follow-up. And then, of course, the world of statistics has changed rapidly over the years, and so we've tried to broaden that piece about statistics in the protocol, particularly making a nod to Bayesian designs and estimands. So let's move on to another one of my favourite areas, essential records. And here you will notice some rather large changes. So you'll remember the old essential documents tables. So before, during and after the trial. Now what we were finding was that people will use these as a checklist. So, oh, have I got this record? Oh, no, I haven't got that. Oh, I better write a file note to say that I haven't got a randomisation schedule because this is an open label trial. So it wasn't adding anything. So really what we're trying to get at is make sure your essential records are able to tell the story of what happened in that trial. So that's why we're also thinking about the uniqueness of every clinical trial. So think about what is it that you need to be able to have access to be able to read, to be able to understand what happened to the data, your participants, and the processes for the conduct of the trial. So it's really about telling that story. And the other thing that was happening with these essential documents is people were filing things at the very last minute. Now, it's not an archive. It's a living, breathing repository, or should I say repositories, that can help you with your sponsor oversight. So utilise your essential records as such. We also updated the glossary term. So you'll notice we talk about essential records and not just essential documents, because we're talking about the fact that they're data and relevant metadata. So what is the data that describes what the data is in that clinical trial? And we're also emphasising that ongoing management of the trial, that oversight. Because really what we're trying to do here is to encourage thinking, because it does allow that continuous evaluation of what is happening in the clinical trial. So think about those essential records, not just as somewhere that, oh yeah, I need to keep that documentation, I'll just go and file it later. But think of it as a living, breathing support for how you oversee your clinical trial. So once again, we have this little table, and of course, because it was major revamp, then the essentiality and the management of essential records actually wasn't there previously in R2. So here we have that introduction. So what are the records? So, records can be generated before, during the conduct of the trial. And the extent of those records dependent on the trial design. So once again, it's bringing in that individuality of the clinical trial. And of course, you then need to determine which records are essential. So we have you a little bit of a help here. So you need to assess whether a record is essential and whether it needs to be retained, utilising the criteria below. So we do have a table which gives an idea of some which records which might be essential records, depending on the trial design. And at the end of the day, we're trying to tell you to tell us a story of what happened to the participants and their data and how the protocol was followed during that trial. So what does that mean for investigators and sponsors? There are no tables. It is there to encourage thinking. But of course, you still need to be able to have some format for how you file your records. And of course, there is still that CDISC TMF reference model, because you still need to have some structure to be able to find your records. And of course, they need to be accessible to inspectors for evaluating the trial conduct. I think you're going to get quite a lot of questions about sort of what are essential records, so be prepared for those. So think about it. Is this a record that helps tell the story of that clinical trial? So a little taster for Annex 2. So this additional considerations for different types of trial design. And so here I'm just going to utilise the Step 2 deck. So Step 2 because this is as it's been released for public consultation. Usual legal notice that comes with the use of this deck. So as you know, it was signed off for public consultation, and we've received all the comments back. And yes, as you can see from this deck, we are a little bit delayed. But there is a reason for that, in that you'll remember that we received 7,000 comments for the principles in Annex 1. Well, I wonder if you could guess as to how many we received for Annex 2 alone. So bear in mind, the principles in Annex 1, talking about 80-page document. Here we're talking about 11, 12-page document. And if I was there in person, I'd be asking you to shout out some numbers as to how many that we received in terms of comments. Well, I'll tell you anyway. We received 1,000 comments for that short document, so it does take some going through those comments to make sure that we can reach a consensus with the text that will come out to be the final guideline. So Annex 2, we tried to have a crystal ball to sort of think to the future, what sorts of trial design, what sorts of data sources might be coming in the future. But it's not comprehensive. We didn't have that crystal ball. We tried to think, so we tried to write it in a manner that allowed you to think, well, actually, I've not exactly got this that's written down in Annex 2, but actually it does seem to be in sort of keeping with how that is utilised. So I can't give you an example at the moment because these are things that haven't been thought of yet. You do need to read Annex 2 in conjunction with the principles and Annex 1, because there are no new requirements in Annex 2. It's just given you some considerations for these different types of trial design elements and data sources. So we're thinking about decentralized clinical trial elements, so where some activities take place outside of your routine brick and mortar investigator site, or pragmatic elements, so where you're getting data perhaps from an electronic health record which is collected in the manner which is always collected, or the use of other data sources, so perhaps real world data, so that's been already collected, maybe in the form of a registry or even claims data. And of course, we don't endorse any specific design elements or data sources. So just as a reminder as to where Annex 2 fits in, still underpinned by the principles of ICH GCP, and it's really just one of the rooms in the house, because we tried to use that house analogy, that provides additional considerations for these different types of trial design. So what sorts of things to remember? So don't read E6L3 in isolation. So I've spoken a lot about E8R1, so general considerations for clinical studies. So read that as well, because it talks about patient engagement, healthcare professional engagement, but it also starts with the quality by design and the critical to quality factors. So read that. But also, you'll notice that as you go through a clinical trial, so from the design through the conduct, analysis and reporting, other efficacy guidelines need to be looked at. So for instance, you've got the E9 statistical analysis, you've got E9R1 about the use of estimans. So think about these other guidelines that you need to think about when you are writing your, from protocol writing to actually the writing of your clinical trial report. So of course, clinical study report is in E3. So don't read E6 in isolation. Think about those other efficacy guidelines. So think about, what is my role in the clinical trial? What do I need to do? So think about that and read the appropriate E-guidelines that are pertinent to your role. Because E6 covers right from the design to the reporting of your clinical trial. So make sure that you've got a well-designed protocol. So what is it that is your research question? What data do I need to answer that question? Then think about how that is conducted at the investigator site. How is investigational product controlled? How do I finalise the data sets prior to going to analysis and reportings? So that for the statistical analysis, I always used to, as an inspector, I would often be asking about database unlock, because I would expect a database unlock to be a very unusual occurrence, and that somebody very high up in the organisation has signed in blood that the database needs to be unlocked. So think about when a database is unlocked. Is it necessary? Is it adding any potential bias to what you're reporting? Didn't mention too much about reporting in terms of transparency. So there is an expectation that all clinical trials are registered on publicly accessible databases, and of course the results need to be posted. And then if you look at the informed consent section in section 2.8.10, elements of the informed consent, you'll see that we talk about the results being made available to the participant. And of course the clinical trial report needs to be available to the investigator, or at least some summary. And at the end of the trial, well, what happens to those essential records? So that's the time that you need to think about archiving. But as you read through the guideline, you'll notice that throughout we talk about proportionality and risk-based approaches. So think about what it is I need to answer the research question, how do I de-risk the protocol? And whatever I do, do it in a proportionate and risk-based manner. Because at the end of the day, we need to look after our participants, right safety and well-being, and ensure the reliability of those trial results. And with that, I will leave you and ask you for any questions. I do understand that I will be joining you after the efficacy guidelines have been presented in the panel discussion. So I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you very much for your time and attention.